What is the intersection between national security on the one hand and commercial transactions such as TikTok on the other?
Well, TikTok's a special one, in part because of the data that could be captured and transferred, also the content. I'm always struck by the difference between TikTok China and TikTok America. Let me just say TikTok America is the equivalent of drinking several cans of soda a day and eating an awful lot of candy, whereas TikTok China is much more spinach and educational. Plus there's the potential, obviously, for political bias and the rest. So I think that it influences security both in the data transfer way, potentially, as well as in the content way. And I think it makes the larger point that in many cases, economic transactions do have a national security dimension, whether it's direct or indirect.
Given that dimension of national security in normal commercial transactions, where should the line be? I mean, how far should the government go in really interfering with commerce?
It's a good question. It's hard to give you a rule of thumb that's in every instance, but one ought to at least assess the national security implications. That's why, for example, you have CFIUS, the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States, that looks at when you have incoming, say, investment, does that give this party access to something that could give them, therefore, data or information or technologies that either could give them a competitive advantage or even a strategic advantage. I think that's a legitimate screen to have. Export controls are a second legitimate screen before we ship something. Overseas, we want to say, again, is this giving someone a competitive advantage? Could they take this technology, which almost all technology is dual use, and use it either for internal repression, or could something that's meant for, say, a civilian airliner end up in the cockpit of a military fighter, and so forth. So I think the idea of asking those questions is healthy. Probably also, David, in this day and age, it's not just security, but against foreign challenges because of COVID, because of natural disasters. At times we've got to ask questions, what do we need to either have domestically produced, home shoring, near shoring, friend shoring, when we put together supply chains of critical materials and so forth. So I think, we need to ask, to what degree are we comfortable leaving ourselves somewhat vulnerable or open to the vicissitudes of what other governments might do or just simply what may happen out there?
The specific national security concerns surrounding TikTok range from the data it collects from users in the U.S. to the very heart of its secret sauce, its algorithm. Jennifer Huddleston is a senior fellow of tech policy at the Cato Institute.
When we look at some of the concerns around the TikTok algorithm, for example, is this actually about TikTok or actually about TikTok's ties to China? Or is this about the way that we see young people using social media more generally that may be causing some discomfort from older generations? What the national security interest is actually a bit of a debate. One of the things that has been pointed to are questions around the data, and particularly how it relates to a Chinese national security law, and concerns that in a way that the Chinese government could lean on TikTok's parent company, that could lean on TikTok in Singapore, that could lean on TikTok US, that could force the data on the American users to be given to the Chinese Communist Party. But we've also heard concerns expressed more around the TikTok algorithm or around the specific speech on TikTok that some policymakers are considering to be propaganda. And the question here then that is raised is, how do we balance potential concerns about national security, particularly related to the data elements, with concerns around free speech? Because it's important to remember that not only are we talking about TikTok and TikTok's expression rights, we're talking about the expression rights of the millions of American users.
If those are the potential national security interests, the data and the algorithm, can we in the United States protect those national security interests if ByteDance still has any control, any ownership at all of the algorithm or the data?
This has been one of the important elements of the debate. Are there less restrictive means that could address the potential national security concerns while not having as significant of an impact on the speech, particularly of the American users of this platform? So some of the things that have been proposed include things like banning TikTok from government devices. This is something we've seen done at both a state and federal level that has largely been upheld to ensure that that data perhaps is more secure. There's also been conversations around what was called Project Texas, where TikTok offered to localize the American data on Oracle servers in Texas and allow the US government additional oversight over that data. The other question about the data is is this data is this a particular risk when it comes to TikTok's data? Much of this data is already available on the market from data brokers. We've also seen that the Chinese have engaged in numerous hacks to obtain American data. So is the risk of TikTok any bigger than the data privacy or data security risk out there more generally? And is this something that instead of talking about TikTok, we should be talking about data security and data privacy more broadly?
The focus is very much on the administration of President Trump right now, but the statute came from Congress. Does the congressional statute have a threshold ownership that if you get it down to a certain number, a certain percentage, then it's okay?
So there are percentages in the congressional statute, but I think what's more interesting is this question of what does a qualified divestiture look like? Because the law from Congress is very vague on what would actually have to be divested. Are we talking about TikTok's brand? Are we talking about TikTok's algorithm? Are we talking about the data itself? Because this national security concern has also been rather vague.
Does the president have the ability to extend 75 days? The statute had an initial extension, but I don't remember a second extension.
So this has been a really good question because the statute had a 90-day extension. There were also actions from the Department of Justice in a letter sent to some of the American companies that could have been subject to the penalties that seems to have been around the potential non-enforcement of those penalties, ensuring that the app was still available to the Americans who have used it for expression. But as you mentioned, we've seen this done by executive order and executive order, kind of like hitting the snooze button again and again, which doesn't actually get to that underlying question and those underlying issues that are so important to this debate. Regardless of what happens to TikTok, at the heart of this law is the question of how do we balance potential national security concerns with the speech rights of millions of Americans, particularly on a popular social media app, but more generally, what sort of authority do we allow the executive to have to intervene into the App Store market, to intervene potentially into the speech rights of millions of Americans? Even if this continues to be done by executive order, even if TikTok lives to see the day, we haven't necessarily settled that important debate.
There is in principle a deal, and clearly, by the way, President Trump wants a deal for whatever set of reasons. I tend not to be in the business of ascribing motives, but he is clearly anxious to have a deal. He keeps kicking down the stream, down the road, the deadline here. But I would just say, whatever the details are at the end of the day in terms of data and content, I would also love to see reciprocity, though if we do end up with control over both data and content, then we don't need it. Then essentially we set up a parallel situation with China.
Though everyone is focused on the effect of the ban on TikTok, the statute itself is directed not at TikTok, but at U.S. companies, including access to the social media site over their products.
I think it's important to also remember when we're talking about this particular law that the burden of the law actually falls on American companies. The law says that TikTok must divest from its parent company ByteDance, or it otherwise bans the distribution, maintenance, or updating of the app. That means those that are actually facing penalties are not TikTok itself, but are companies like Apple and Google, who, if they continued to host the app, would be the ones that would potentially be facing penalties that have up to a 5-year statute of limitations that could extend beyond this current administration.
And the TikTok case raises some big questions about reciprocity, both in the way that China treats U.S. social media companies and in what other countries might do to regulate U.S. companies.
It's not like we American social media companies have access to China in terms of asking them to transfer data or allowing us to control content. So this is, incredibly one-sided.
You raised the reciprocity issue going back and forth between the U.S. and China. Are we opening up the door potentially to other countries saying, wait a second, we don't want you to own the data, the algorithm when you're coming into our country?
Quite possibly, and I think the fact that the United States has been adopting a more nationalist position, a more unilateralist position on tariffs and many other aspects of policy, an America First approach, the Europeans clearly do not feel special, to say the least. So yes, I think we have to expect that we're going to move into a world now, we're moving towards a world where alliances and partnerships count for less, and others are going to treat us more at arm's length and set up the kind of rules vis-a-vis the United States that we're increasingly setting up vis-a-vis them.